Um, in a minute, we'll do introductions, but before that, I'll mention that if you have any questions or any points that you want to kind of float into the conversation, please use the Q&A feature here on Zoom, or if you're on LinkedIn or YouTube, you can use the comments section there, or if you're within our Slack community for permit, obviously you can post it in Slack. Without further ado, let's jump in with quick introductions. My name is Or Wise. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Permit. With me is Gabriel, our head of DevRel.
Hello.
And we have two amazing guests that I think are spot on perfect for the topic that we want to discuss today, which is Google Zanzibar and fine-grained authorization. We have Dr. Rohit Khare. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
All right, great.
Yeah, wonderful. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Rohit Khare. I am old. That's one thing I used to have hair when I started out in computer security. I had the unique bit of luck and privilege starting out my career early on the web, working back on SSL and then the early specs before it became TLS at the World Wide Web Consortium. Started out my career in working on web standards for HTTP, for HTML and XML. Later on in my career, did a little bit of penitence by working on micro formats, one of the ways we're getting structured data into our web index. And to go through a meandering career a little bit further towards startups and real-time middleware, I was working on some social graph technology that became part of Google Plus, which is where I first encountered the access control problems in a social networking setting that led to Zanzibar. And most relevant to today, I'm old gear. I was at Google for about 10 years after that. I noticed that in Google Cloud. And for a while there, I had the pleasure of being the product manager for Google Cloud IAM, Identity and Access Management. I subsequently left to join a couple of cybersecurity startups. So my knowledge is a bit out of date, but I'm coming from a long background in trying to figure out how to make security simpler for as many users as possible.
That's awesome. And I think you already gave us something positive in realizing that in tech and in authorization, you can survive into old age. Though you don't seem that old, but it still gives us a hope as we look down the path. And we have another amazing guest with us, Jonathan Whitaker. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I don't have quite the resume there, but nonetheless, I love this space. So I'm Jonathan Whitaker. I'm a staff software engineer at OKTA and Auth0, and I'm one of the maintainers on the OKTA fine grain authorization product. And we have an open source offering of that product called OpenFGA. OpenFGA is a CNCF sandbox project, and we're looking to incubate here pretty soon as well. For a maintainer on the OpenFGA project. So my background in identity and access management kind of goes back about 8 to 9 years. I've worked on small startups, helping them solve authorization problems. And I've kind of seen different problem spaces of different scales, from very small startup to really large enterprise. I worked with the Adobe Enterprise platform. And the problem we were trying to solve at Adobe was similar to the problem that Google was trying to solve, which is how do we bring flexible authorization modeling to the whole enterprise that every service can share, and that you can, distribute access policies across service boundaries and API domains. So that was another problem that we were trying to solve there. It's a hard problem, simple premise, hard problem, lots of fun. That's kind of when I was first exposed to the Google Zanzibar white paper back in 2019 or so. And I took particular fascination to it because of the architecture and the scale components and the flexibility and the relationship modeling that came with it. So that's kind of where my journey with this started. And then that just naturally evolved into my current role at OKTA on the fine grain authorization product. And here I am still trying to solve hard authorization problems. And I love this space and working with the community. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us and being our guest. And there's also something already positive to take from, I think, your background. So you mentioned this is a long journey, but it's a fun one and an interesting one. So we already know that it's going to be a long journey. It's going to be fun and we're going to survive till the end. So that's good. Now, with that groundwork established, let's go into the topic at hand. So we're obviously here to talk about Google Zanzibar and the concepts of fine-grained authorization. But maybe before we dive directly into that, maybe let's touch on the problem space, because we see that this is definitely interesting a lot of people. A lot of companies are trying to address this. There are different implementations of Google Zanzibar, but in the first place, why is this problem interesting? Why is this problem important? And how are people getting into this problem? Rohit, maybe you want to kick us off.
Well, the one long way of looking at it is that you're mentioning a few chances of having a fun and long career at it. Another looking at it is that the problem is hard to solve and has been unsolved for too long. The optimism we have seen is that single sign-on, for example, the authentication problem should be our role model here. We figured out, hey, it's pretty bad to just try to roll your own username and passwords encryption service. It was literally the Turing Award talk by um, Reflections on Trusting Trust, back in 83 or 84, saying, look, you just can't trust writing your own crypt functions. And yet that was in the 80s. Kerberos came around. You are still dealing with derivatives of that today. We have now reached the point where maybe half I saw last year of enterprises are at least using MFA and SSO, which is single sign-on with multi-factor and a second key. If you remember back to secure ID dongles, RSA stuff, public key, this has been a very long story on the auth end side alone, which is just a matter of knowing who you are. Doing what you can do is exciting, which is, the question of entitlements or permissions or privileges and that long literature. Auth-Z, authorization, has taken us a lot longer. And so the idea is we've finally gotten to the point in the last few years of it being kind of almost developer malpractice to roll your own login screen and not do your own auth. Hence, OKTA and some other shortcuts as well. The emergence of a wave of startups doing innovative work like Auth0 and Auth-Z, it says that I have hope that someday developers will stop writing their own permission systems and users and group management systems and resource hierarchy systems. You can say who has permission to do what. And so how we get into this and when developers get into it, I think is often too late, because when you start from hello world, you have to do a login system almost immediately the moment you have your second user. Alice wants to be different from Bob. You learn to look for a library that does SSO or authentication. But authorization can creep up on you over time, because Alice and Bob might in your app be doing whatever they're doing, whether it's auctioning books or running payroll, and it's a little while for you to realize, hey, maybe Bob's an admin. So we're working on that. It's going to be hopefully less long of a journey than the almost generation that's gone by in making authentication better. But with that, I kind of had it back there. But I figured out that one of the signs of our maturity in this field is I still feel like we're short of a cocktail party intro on what's the difference between authentication and authorization. Try one out with you guys so we can get some good Q&A here, but often talking about I'm like, hey, is it better to be James Bond or 007? It's one thing to know you're Bond, James Bond. Great, I know who you are. I'm really not afraid of you until I know that you have a license to kill.
Right. I think you're touching on a very important point here, that there's an evolution going. Like authentication grew over time, and the mindset is already changed as well. So I think if you go back 7, 10 years back and you tell people, oh, are you using authentication as a service? People would go, what the hell is that? And once you tell them, they would say, well, why do I need that? I can do my own password. What's the big deal? Oh, you put some salt, some hashes, that's fine. And then it explodes in your face. And nowadays, when you talk to people about authentication, it's almost immediate. Of course, I'm not building authentication on my own. Am I nuts? And we're seeing that realization, the understanding that there's a lot of depth here, which we're going to touch on, or at least scratch the surface on today in this conversation. So there's a lot of depth there that goes into authorization as well, and comes with a lot of the same requirements and challenges. Speaking of which, so what is Zanzibar and what are the specific challenges that it's addressing? And where did it start? And John, I think I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah. So from my understanding, right, at least as described by the paper and from having conversations with various people in industry around Zanzibar, Google wanted to bring a solution to their whole, developer teams that would allow them to be able to express the kinds of access policies that they needed in Google across various services and domain API boundaries within Google. They wanted to be able to do so at the scales needed by Google and with security and privacy in mind, right? So if you've revoked someone's access, regardless of the region in which that came from, you should be able to enforce that policy, within same region, cross-region semantics, you name it. And obviously, since authorization is so critical to any decision being made in your applications, that also needs to be extremely performant, because your critical paths of your applications are delegating to this service to make authorization decisions very frequently, very high volume, and in critical paths. So the latency has to be extremely low there. So when I look at this, kind of the holy grail of an authorization product or an authorization system would be developers can declaratively define their authorization model. How does authorization work in your application or across your platform? That should be declarative, easy to understand. It should be a statement that you can share with anyone in your organization, be it product managers, be it engineers, and they should be able to read that declarative model and understand or have an intuition for how authorization works in that product. And then it should be easy to roll that model out, right? It should be easy to roll that model out and enforce that model and interact with the system with extremely low latency and with privacy and security in mind. And what we've seen, over the last, up until this point, really, is that people roll their own authorization, right? They used to roll their own authentication, and authorization is right now where authentication was 10 to 15 years ago. So instead of having authorization logic homegrown and scattered as, be it SQL queries or explicit business logic in application code, what we're seeing evolve in industry right now is this desire to move that policy enforcement as explicit statements in code out to declarative models. And that's kind of one of the pieces of Zanzibar, is their modeling language allows for this very rich policy expression involving relationship-based access control. And with that, you can express a lot of different kinds of access policies, which cater to a lot of different application domains. You can imagine within Google, you have a lot of different application domains, and each one of those application domains has different policy enforcement that it has to enforce. So the fact that Zanzibar could cater to the variety of policies in the Google domain, that's a pretty compelling story behind, the Zanzibar design. So those are some of the kind of things, another thing, the last thing I'll mention, and this is often overlooked when we talk about Zanzibar in the community, is one of the core underpinnings behind this was a product need, not an engineering need, but a product need. Right. Product wanted to start enforcing the ability to have cross-resource access policy enforcement across different API domains. Adobe Enterprise, when I worked there, had that same exact problem. You acquire a company, maybe you acquire another company, you join the applications, and you try to create a unified platform or experience around those. How do you do that if authorization is uniquely implemented in each one of those different applications? That's a really hard problem to solve. So if you can unify your access control system in some way, you can start enforcing cross service policy enforcement. And that doesn't just help increase your privacy or security posture, it also increases your product capabilities. You can view this as a first-class citizen of product development, not just a security or privacy practice. And so one thing, since we have an audience here, one thing I want to say to the audience is that I think that for too long, authorization has been viewed as an afterthought. Okay, now we have our MVP of our APIs designed, now we need to add access controls. I think as an industry, we've been doing this all wrong. Access controls should be a forethought in the design process of your APIs, because access controls actually impact your API design. And instead of looking at these things in terms of security and privacy, which are very important, but you should also look at it as, how can this impact my product experience? Product managers should be as deeply involved in what the access control experience should look like as they are with the MVP of their APIs. So those are some of my thoughts in that regard. Yeah.
Spot on. I have to say that I agree and often use as talking points most of the things that you said. I extremely relate to the empowering all of the stakeholders, not just the developers, but security team, product, support, professional services, sales. In the end of the day, when we're building systems, when we're building products, it's all about connecting people and systems to what we've built. And if for every little thing we have to turn developers into a bottleneck, everyone's having a bad time, especially the developers. So now I think we're starting to understand the problem, and we're starting to understand that there's something very compelling here in the Zanzibar mindset and the implementations that exist there. So for a second, let's take a zoom out, and then let's try to explain what Zanzibar is and how unique it is. And I'm going to roll that to you, Rohit. But first, kind of maybe set the stage. So Zanzibar has become very popular. There are multiple implementations. There's the obviously the Google implementation that they haven't shared. What a weird thing to do, to just do the white paper but not share the actual source code. There's multiple companies like GitHub and Airbnb with Himeji that implemented Zanzibar internally. There are multiple open source projects like OpenFGA that John is working on. At Pyramid, we have our own Zanzibar-like implementation that combines it with policy as code. So this is something that is becoming prolific. It's something that is getting a lot of attention. But what the hell is it? And how, as a developer, can I understand this? And can we boil this down to something that a 7-year-old can understand? And one a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, why not? Can we boil this down to something very simple?
That's a little harder, because for a 2-year-old, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine, and that's the entirety of it.
Yeah, that's actually not bad. But let's try to kind of get into what this thing is, what is unique about it, and maybe also kind of extend into how this is similar or different to policy as code implementations like OPA and CEDAR.
There's a lot in that series of questions, so I'm going to follow it a second. I've already kind of almost filled out my first page of notes here on points to come back to. Let me at some effort trying to hopefully get feedback too from the audience. If someone's watching the chats and the questions, we can kind of dial up and down the level of detail we're getting at here. One is, let me catch up with, again, what is Zanzibar, and let's go back to the original paper and let's talk about one preamble, and then let's dial in important thing on how to read the paper. One preamble is that, you have to not having the implementation out there. Well, we talk about Zanzibar being often an island, the Galapagos, right? It's very famous for having evolved all these unique species because it's so disconnected from it. And there is a lot of technology within Google that gets the paper written about it, often maybe a few years after it's been built. And there's a lot of other things Google does really well in the open source world, contributing, offering packages. But there's almost a difference between what comes out with research. And the MapReduce paper came out decades ago, and it led to this explosion of systems like Hadoop and dozens of startups and the whole big data space. The Dremel paper and BigQuery, so in this case, even the last system I worked on there was a system called Mesa and Napa, planet scale data warehouses. And so the experience papers will come out and people will start seeing a number of startups or ideas off there. So this pattern kind of exists. But the other reason that these things don't get shipped is that they are built a bit in isolation. There is such a pyramid of Google technologies. If you look at the original Zanzibar paper, it casually mentions, by the way, the write's a little slower because they go to Spanner. And Spanner is another technology for planet scale SQL database, which again, at the time was kind of those mind-blowing ideas there too. And it's still at the core of it. And so when you have all these separate systems, it's a little hard to pull one out and make it out there as a reference implementation. So it's very exciting to see all the innovation that came out of the paper. Second is to, where does Zanzibar come from? And much like his Adobe story, look, Google originally started out very proudly not having user identities at all. When the search engine first came out in the 90s, it was like, you don't have to sign in, you don't have to create a Google Yahoo account, we don't have mail. Obviously 20th anniversary of Gmail just passed. At some point, they realized, maybe we need to know who our customers are. And there's a system called Gaia, Google Accounts and ID Administration. And for many years, the thing that knit products together is simply that at least we don't have you log in multiple times and do multiple passwords. This is that same stage of maturity the company was at, in the 2000s, of at least having a single login system. But indeed, each product team would go off and have their own velocity and create their own definition of what the object hierarchy would be. When you have maps, is it a map and then points within it, or are restaurants a collection or tagged lists? Well, let the maps team figure it out. It doesn't mean that there's anything that lets, have access to sharing an item that has a map coordinate in it and a photo from some other service. It turned out that, again, one of the drivers was not just developer productivity to say, let's have authorization be externalized, but what John was getting at in terms of consistent user experiences. And so when I arrived at the company around the rise of Google Plus, was the first time really dealing with trying to do social sharing and in a single post that might have a photo story of a restaurant review. And now these teams are having to coordinate on having a pin and a review and a star rating and an identity. Put aside this whole real names argument about sometimes, you have one company and one identity, but the customer doesn't realize it. So Adobe, hopefully they know their Adobe products or they got an acquisition will be an Adobe name on it. But YouTube and Google Plus, I don't even know if in all the surveys people knew they were the same company, maybe even now. So the fact that you had a single auth end system was where the company was at. The Zanzibar model came out of thinking about as Drive got richer and Drives were not single user, but you need to share folders. As products like Google Plus came up on the horizon, as you need more teams to have velocity, they said, let's at least pull this out and have a declarative format. And so the fact that you can read and write and share the policy as code is one important thing. But the second is, wait a second, we have a bunch of religions for how to do authorization, discretionary access control, attribute-based access control, role-based access control. And one of the challenges is that if you look at the literature, often access is just abstract, but you need to know who the users are. So you need a directory, going back to that Alice and Bob problem and the authentication problem. And the other is a consistent set of vocabulary for the roles. And that led to the centralization. And that led to the insight of saying, what's a more flexible way to let product teams do what they want? And this is part two. So one part of the Zanzibar paper is, yes, you can get wrapped up in Zookeys and databases and performance, and there's an amazing amount of interesting detail we can talk about, and Jonathan, other implementations I've run into. But it makes us lose sight of the most basic one, which is that its insight was a bit on relationship-based access control. The fact that you realize that you also need a database of not just who the people are, but that objects don't occur in isolation. Right? The canonical model that's often influenced developers is Unix and POSIX file systems. And there's just a bunch of users and a bunch of files, and they maybe have directories that inherit things. There's only read, write, and execute. But when you start thinking about systems like Google Cloud and AWS Cloud with tens of thousands of individual permissions, these things get hard with thousands of custom roles, and maybe even the ability for users to create roles beyond owner, viewer, and editor that are more custom. That's where this environment came up. And so Zanzibar's the most other half of the paper that's worth paying attention to and realizing and reading and understanding as developers is, what is the vocabulary? What are the semantics? What do we want to mean? What are the objects? So maybe maps come with layers. Maybe drives come with folders. Maybe machines and cloud come with zones and security groups. The fact that Zanzibar can express those relations as well is important. Sorry for the long monologue. It was unfortunately a response to a long question.
Tons of knowledge, so that's yeah. Right. It's interesting, like you describe the way that you develop the paper, right? And it's great. I just searched today on GitHub, and there are more than 10 implementation of Zanzibar. It's amazing that a paper that you release creating a movement. But I have a question, actually, it's more to John as the implementer of such Zanzibar. So your work for OKTA, right? The giant of the giants of the AAM space. You can choose everything. You can choose existing policy model. You can choose attribute-based. You can choose a declarative language that you will design from scratch. What make you choosing Zanzibar and branding the OpenFGA even with Zanzibar? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is what you find in Zanzibar that you haven't found in other common practice like open policy agent authorization models.
Yeah, great question. As far as, so the early beginnings of the OKTA FGA project, it actually started in Auth0 before Auth0 was acquired by OKTA. And Auth0 has this division called OKTA, the Office of the CTO, and they're kind of an R&D group for Auth0. They're also referred to as Auth0 Labs. So around the time the Google Zanzibar paper came out, right, this R&D group, my colleague Damien Schinkelman, who was actually going to be here instead of me, they started doing research around this and, built an initial preliminary POC kind of inspired by Zanzibar, if you will, and tried to do some product discovery around it and see if there was market opportunity behind it. And based on pre-existing knowledge with customers, customer demands, and some of the needs that they're seeing arise from, this product space, they saw a really solid opportunity for this product to actually have some legitimate market value as a SaaS. So that's kind of the origins in Auth0. Now, in general, in the community, I can actually say before I joined Auth0 and OKTA, I was actually working on my own. I was trying to productize this as well. I actually was thinking about starting a small little startup around this, because this is a problem that has unimaginable, like untapped opportunity. And I think we're obviously seeing that in the market now, given the fact that there are so many SaaSes popping up around it. But a lot of people in the community just took fascination to the Zanzibar paper and started with the paper reverse engineering Zanzibar inspired implementations. And I say inspired because what you'll see out there in the community is that every Zanzibar inspired implementation has their different interpretations or flavors of what they've read from the paper, or they've specifically chosen to address certain design characteristics described in the paper and have, in some cases specifically chosen to not implement other components described in the paper, at least at this time. Maybe they will in the future. They just haven't yet, whether those are Zookeys or this distributed caching with consistent hashing model. There's a lot of complexities described in the paper that some of these implementations have skipped over. That's where we're seeing the community really kind of come together, is we're seeing these different flavors. Some are like, no, we're going to implement Zanzibar to the T. Some are like, we're just going to implement these important characteristics. And then some are just like, we'll just use their modeling language and kind of derive something inspired off of that. But other than that, we'll build the rest of our system, how we want to. So yeah, it's been kind of fun, but I would say that this is this is a problem space that still needs a solution, just like authentication did 10, 15 years ago. And so there's tons of market opportunity here. OKTA and Auth0 obviously saw that opportunity. And along this journey, we also decided that we might be able to have more of an influence in this space and help and reach a broader audience if we also open source our core engine. So that was one of the motivating factors behind joining the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and open sourcing OpenFGA. So
cool. I have to agree with what you describe as the different flavors that you get of Zanzibar. And I don't think there's actually one single solution that has everything. There are always pros and cons. And we actually don't even know if the original Zanzibar at Google has all the things that they describe in the white paper. So it might be all to some degree imaginary. Rohit, maybe you can tell us later, or maybe keep it a secret, because the mystery will keep it growing. I think one of the key points that Zanzibar kind of stands unique in, and also has different perspectives in the implementation, and also in contrast to other policy solutions, is how you manage data and how you manage consistency. Rohit, you want to maybe touch on that, maybe a little bit on Zookeys, kind of starting to dive a little deeper.
Yeah, I think there's a mention in there about how Cloud IAM is a layer on top of Zanzibar, right? That's the point. That's where the status was at that time. And it's worth thinking about where those challenges lie, right? So, I don't want to scare you off by getting too into implementation details and things that happen at scale, because there's often a fascination, and certainly if you're on the Hacker News type of community, there's fascination kind of maybe problems that exist only at scale. And, there's, I think, sorry, I'm on Steve and the Yagni, you ain't going to need it, And so sometimes there are details in here, like, for example, fan out. Having access control to say who can read, someone's tweets or messages or posts, may be easy to do for set intersection at small scale. But what if you have a head of state? And there's a little mention there in Leopard. And how do you do this at extremely large scale when you've got fan out to millions of servers? And, literally, you've got millions of followers. What happens when you have, a message from a major celebrity? That's interesting. It's a fascinating problem. It gets into the details of how do you do consistency? What kind of light cone do you have? What time does it take to propagate changes? Do you want to have a concept like Twitter has of blocked distribution, or are blocks not something you have? But, let's pull back. That's often not the first problem people need to deal with. And it's probably not the majority improvement we can make in developer experience. For most developers, the experience improvements are day-to-day in terms of simply getting one headache off your plate of having to model this at all. And so this is the policy as code. How expressive is this? Can I read and code review this change that they want to do about adding a new resource type or a new permission or a new kind of relation easily, and press a button and expect it to deploy, and then not have systems crash when they realize, wait, these tables were written when the users only had 4 roles, and now there's a 5th role, and things are not consistent. I don't know what to do with these old backups of these tables. That's where the rubber meets the road. And so, as much as it's interesting to talk about the problems that exist in the engineering level at scale, it's also important to talk about why do you have to layer on top of this for engineering problems that occur in day-to-day usage. So one aspect of policy as code, which was not a term that existed back when the paper was written, but is obviously important today, was still in the culture. There, of course, was another Galapagos-like bespoke code, source code control system. But essentially, I would say the external version was like git or it didn't happen, right? And simply the act 2 for developers and professionals to be able to say, hey, changes to security, changes where we create a new group or a new resource type or a new semantic, you could review those and they get checked in, and nothing changes in production until those concepts are out there. And then from there, we can auto-generate documentation. Guess what? You mentioned, how many years different is from authentication. It's also not many years removed from API design. A client server APIs is highly bespoke or used to use an object model, an object broker like Corba or DCOM. And now through REST, we have a common interface through HTTP, and often through a couple of core formats like JSON and common language. But you also have things like Swagger and RPC definitions. And when you wake up in the morning, you're out to add a new feature to your system, you declare its new interface, and you expect a lot of things to happen automatically, like the docs and the API calling conventions. And of course, the authentication and authorization should go along with that. So the concept of as code is an important part of the deployment model that was in Zanzibar. But I'm going to pause here and say, and also toss it back to both you and Jonathan, talk about ReBAC and relationship-based access control and what makes it different. But I'd like to pause there and see if you had some thoughts there about just the system side of things.
I can speak to the difference between policy engines that are out there like OPA, and kind of the Zanzibar model. That comes up a lot in our communities, right? Like, why would I use OpenFGA or OKTA FGA as opposed to Open Policy Agent? And I think it's a great question, right? Open Policy Agent is an insanely powerful policy evaluation engine. CEDAR very similarly as well. And if I'm just being frank, right, those technologies probably are more expressive, right? They are a superset, if you will, in what they can express as opposed to a purely relationship-based access control model. The downside to those systems, right? And it's not one is better than the other. There's different trade-offs.
Pros and cons.
Yeah, pros and cons. Open Policy Agent and CEDAR, for example, they don't bring solutions necessarily to the data flow problem. They deliver in developers' hands this incredibly powerful evaluation engine that is highly expressive in its ability to define different kinds of authorization models. Very expressive modeling language. But another piece of the authorization story is the data flow problem. Okay, so you have a policy, you have this declarative policy as code, but how do you get the information that you need at runtime to evaluate those policies in real time and with low latency and so on and so forth? And how do you solve the different kinds of authorization questions that might arise, practically speaking, in an application, such as the regular authorization question, can a user perform this action on this resource? We call that the forward query, or like the check in our API terms. It's just a direct check, individual resource, individual action, individual user. But you also see other query patterns arise that are often overlooked in initial design and modeling situations, which you have the reverse query question. What resources, the collection, what resources can an individual user perform an action on? So that returns a list instead of a permit or deny decision. And then you have other variations of that as well, right? Where you see who are the subjects or the principals who can perform a certain action on a specific resource. That's kind of used more for like auditing or understanding what your permission graph is, who are all the subjects. So these different kinds of query problems actually are challenging to solve with just a policy engine. And when you add the data component, what you end up finding, at least application developers using a technology like CEDAR or OPA, is that getting the information into those evaluations in real time with strong consistency, semantics in certain scenarios, that's the problem. The data flow problem is the problem, not the expression or the ability to enforce a policy. So what Zanzibar-inspired models do is they flip They flip that problem on its head. And we say, you know what? View us, OpenFGA, you know, the other ones out there, view us as a first-class citizen of your data, specifically for your permission graph. You write your permission data and your permission graph into us. We are a permission database. We become the source of truth for the permission information that is needed to evaluate permission decisions. And then with that information, with the indexes and with the clever, like, you know, implementations that we have in OpenFGA and in OKTA and everything, we can optimize queries, those queries that I was mentioning, based on that data and based on that declarative model. So what we're really trying to do is encourage the developer community to view permissions as, you know, a database, and you should put your permission data natively as a first-class citizen in that database rather than trying to load it out of band into some other policy engine. So.
Yeah, perfect. I want to kind of highlight or put spotlights on a couple of things that you said to kind of start helping people understanding those pros and cons. So I think one of the highest important things to understand here is that Zanzibar implementations come with ideas about how you should manage data as part of the solution. And they come opinionated. They come with the concept of a graph and tie it to the concept, the underlying concept of relationship-based access control. So if you're already thinking in relationships, if you're thinking about building a graph, if you know that data is going to be one of the key challenges of what you're building, you're already kind of leaning into Zanzibar territory, and you're getting a lot of advantages there. And obviously, if you have greater scale, the more data that you need to manage, the more the consistency of that data matters, more points to the Zanzibar camp. On the other side, if you want a more expressive language, if you want maybe other policy models, not just ReBAC, or you want to mix ReBAC with some other policy languages, you might be leaning more into the policy engines camp, like CEDAR and OPA. I will be amiss if I won't mention that in the world of those policy engines, we have our open source project Opal, which allows you to bring the data and policy into those policy engines. But there's still pros and cons. Like, are we bringing the data in a specific point to each of these engines, or are we managing a big database that has everything there consistent? And according to each problem, each developer will have preferences, and their scenario would have different highlights that might take them into different camps. So unfortunately, the answer is not always clear if you should go with Zanzibar or with another policy engine, but there are definitely pros and cons to consider. Now that kind of
just to underscore that slightly, I mean, part of it also is that the environment keeps changing on us, especially in areas of cloud security, right? This isn't just Alice and Bob as humans anymore. So that data layer has to include millions or thousands of machine accounts, service accounts. Ideally, in a fully zero trust world, you're down to tracking maybe a stack of identities, which is, this is me logging in as an admin, changing the pay stubs and vacation times for another employee in a group subject to regulations for a certain, you know, enterprise, and then it has to relay that out to payroll as on behalf of another service account. That's a level of logic. It's also great to talk about, but the principal side of the equation has gotten much more complicated, and there's many more layers of data to manage. The actions, you know, the kinds of relations you can have, or permissions in other systems, have gotten into the thousands. And then as well, and this is one of the harder things for application developers to realize maybe early on, is that the object hierarchy of whatever data you model, you know, maps, again, maybe they have layers or files are in folders, and you think, well, I'm going to drag a file from one folder to another. You do that in your app business logic. But you may need to reflect that back to your permissions model, because there's so many layers of inheritance. There's things you might inherit because you're a member of a group, things you might inherit because it's a certain type of file, things you might inherit because of that folder, or things you might inherit because of an orthogonal kinds of context like tagging in cloud security, another familiar concept, but you know, maybe you don't have tags in your HR system, but that's coming. So now these are all forces that get you back to saying a policy engine in a research paper looks like a little box and line diagram where I just evaluate the access control system, but all the hard problems, as John was talking on the data flow of how do you realize which relations should be in your code, in your tables, and in your object model, and what relations need to be reflected back into that permissions database so that you can keep it tractable. again, another warning sign that, or another advantage of this is that you can end up with policies that are easy to compute forward but they're practically Turing complete. They've been on the phase of the moon and the tide chart and who has access and when. And therefore you can't render a UI that says, well, can I have a browser pane where I can list all the folders? And suddenly now you're like spending thousands of checks on each one because you can't enumerate, because you can't go backwards. These are things that, again, Zanzibar's design is at least tractable in that narrow mathematical sense, but is a reminder that policy engine in the abstract is where you want to begin as a developer. Although at larger scale, even at medium scale, you can get burned by needing to deeply integrate with your directory, deeply integrate with your document, your application's definition of a data model or hierarchy, even if you're not dealing with planetary scale issues.
I agree.
Yeah, I think actually you mentioned this non-human service account and identities that we have. And it's very interesting because if we are like flipping the ball and looking from the data flow, me and Oren in general in Permit, we have a lot of discussion about a new model of access control. So we had the mandatory access control, which is a very old one, like the administrator. And then we have the discretionary, but we are toward a phase where we have something like proactive access control. So we have like this identity who need to get access somewhere and they need to understand how to get access there, right? And if we are looking at the data, we can expose like evaluation that can explain you, okay, you need now access to this part of data. You need now access to this kind of relationship proactively. And think about like an engine that let you create smart approval flow for AI-based identity or unstructured data, right? Think about.
Yeah, I think you're running into the future. I think it's,
yeah,
this is, well, hopefully not too far in the future, but this is what we called IAM ops at one of the last startups I was doing product strategy for, right? There's the process of which you administer it, but you're absolutely spot on there.
Yeah,
that's something we're actively thinking about, like at OKTA, right? Is how can we, so OKTA has the two kind of work streams right now. We have the customer identity cloud side of things, and we have the workforce identity cloud side of things. And managing access to applications in the workforce or in the customer identity cloud, you usually involve something like when you first join a company, you go and you have to, open up the Excel sheet that someone created 6 months ago that says all the apps that you need access to. And then you have to go to Lighthouse or some kind of, solution that allows you to request permissions and individually one by one go through all of those. Like, let's face it, as an industry, that process sucks. It sucks for everyone. And really, one of the underpinnings for why that sucks is that access control is uniquely implemented across every single one of those applications in that stack. And there's no unified way to grant and authorize access across these different applications owned by different entities. There's no singular way to do that. So what we would really like to see in OKTA in the future, and this is definitely something that is on our radar, is can we unify workforce identity access management, customer identity access management? Can we make that process easier by having a unified authorization system, OKTA FGA, or like the Zanzibar inspired system as the underpinning? Can we have something like that and improve those workflows? So, it might be future facing, but that is something on our roadmap item like today, right? Like we definitely want the industry to evolve in that manner. And it'll be really fun to see how that improves these workflows in the future.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we do want to get to Q&A here, but I really want to underscore how important that is. I mean, you can keep going down the literature. There's a NIST standard for NGAC, Next Generation Access Control. NGAC is fascinating work. It shows a mathematical unification of all these approaches and one that actually is still in a linear time. But that's, I think, probably beyond the scope of today's discussion. But that the fact that that's a future is true. But I think we have a much more practical problem right now, which is that you'd like to be able to say things like interns shouldn't access user data in production. And that actually should be a policy, and be able to make sure that that translates into, well, they can't go into these buckets in S3. They can't go into these folders in Drive. They can't go to these tables in SQL. Will be fascinating to see happen. But the idea is that there's, guess what, another policy language there. Maybe you can only get to the user data after you've been there for 6 months and approved by a peer, or if you are supporting a support ticket, I need to show that you're currently on the phone or currently assigned to handling this ticket, so that you can go look at their data in a multi-user SaaS system. So the unification of workforce, IAM, CIEM, PAM, let's not go into that whole acronym soup here. We sometimes lose sight of the fact that the cybersecurity industry is set up to create lots and lots of narrow solutions, and it seems to reward that. But we have an opportunity to make developers' lives a lot better and a lot easier if we could release some wide things. And we're in this amazing age of AI. Who knows what's going to come next?
So I think we can all agree that decoupling policy and code and unifying your policy across the different surfaces, that's a must. That's coming for everyone. The complexity of your applications are going to force you to deal with it now or in a couple of months. So it's better to already take it into account. And down the road, the complexities of how we work in our organizations and how we combine AI into our applications, that's going to make this explode dramatically. So we should all keep tabs on that. Wrapping that portion of the conversation up, I think we should move to the Q&A because we're starting to kind of pile up questions. So I think I'll just try and tackle them in the order that they were asked. So there's a great question here by an anonymous attendee who asks, how do big companies, Adobe, for example, migrate from their homebrew existing solution into the more modern solutions, be there Zanzibar or something else? John, maybe you can give from your experience there.
Yeah, great question. And honestly, it's probably going to be the hardest part of the whole process that you experience, right, is the migration piece. So first of all, what I found in this space is that all of the existing policy logic is scattered through all of your applications in your platform today. And I bet that the people that wrote that code originally left the company 10 to 15 years ago. So one of the things that I find in trying to remodel your access control in these declarative languages, if nothing else, you learn so much about how access control works in your product. If for no other reason than gaining that education and sharing it with others in your platform, that's worth it in and of itself. Trying to remodel access control using these declarative languages allows you to relearn or learn what you don't know about how access control works in your platform. That's the first starting point to this migrational process. And the outcome of that is an extremely rich learning and education experience that you can share with your whole organization. And you have a tangible artifact that you can share afterwards that says, hey, this model is more or less how authorization works in our product. And to your other point, here are the shortcomings of what we can't model with that declarative model. So now you have this, you have this overlap. You understand what can be and what can't be. And now you can practically, practical engineering focus here, you can practically decompose the problems that you can't necessarily solve with that modeling language and figure out a practical solution for those problems. And for the residual set, you might already have yourself an awesome solution for solving those problems and similar problems of that nature. So those are kind of the first series of steps. And I think there's some really good practical engineering and education that can come from that. Getting into more of the technical side, right? Like once you have identified how you're going to actually model this in this, other declarative modeling paradigm, then you really get into the nitty gritty of the data flow, right? So as policies or as permission data is changing in your existing platform, how do you replicate that, right, in a way to get it over into this new system in a way that can ensure you can, gradually transition over, zero downtime deploy kind of mentality and transition over. And in that space, there's a lot of patterns, there's a lot of techniques. So change data capture is going to come into play, data replication, multi-active active topologies with databases across regions if you have multi-region needs. So technologies like message brokers, PubSub, CDC, these things are going to come into play to help you manage the data flow problem as you make that migrational transition. But you'll find before you even get to that point, you will have learned so much. It'll be so valuable to try to go through this exercise because you'll learn so much about the system in the first place.
As you said in the beginning, it's going to be fun. I want to kind of move us into sudden death mode. So we need kind of shorter answers. I'll sprinkle a bit, add to your answer. I'll also add, if you want to do migrations, start with a slice. Don't try to migrate everything at once. Once you have the principles in place, it will be easier to migrate the rest. Next question for Mark. I'm gonna throw out to you, Rohit. What are some of the guidelines for designing policy for a specific business? I'm boiling down the question also. How How should we kind of think about this? How should we pick the language? What is your advice? And I remind you, we're in sudden death mode.
Yeah, no, I was just listening to the previous question, the data modeling and how we migrate to a schema. Well, this is a matter of taste, and this is not the best, most satisfying answer, but this is why we need to build more community, have more sharing of those actual policy languages and policy models, because this is indeed a hard problem you've got in there. It's a design one, just like you design tables. Where do you design in your system ultra wide tables and say I'm going to have one system of record, or I'm going to have a bunch of star schemas? Data warehouse schema design comes to mind here too. If you have a good handle on your application, hopefully it follows from that. But as a rule of thumb, a sudden death thing to start with, it may right now feel like overkill, but there's a reason why a lot of cloud leaders in the space have ended up with thousands of permissions, because if you put one lock on every API call, it's a start. And that may seem excessive, but that's again why you want to use modern tools to handle maybe dozens or hundreds of these, because it's easier to agglomerate small permissions into roles than to keep realizing, oh, I need a special kind of administrator that can do just this one kind of reassignment.
I agree. I'll add that usually what you want is a language that works for your team. You want something that is future proof for you. So the most important thing is that this is going to change. Whatever you're going to build in a month, 5 months, it's going to be completely different. You'll have new requirements. So don't fall in love with what you're building anyway. Enjoy the fun and the road, and have something that is easy for your team to adjust as you go, and pick with what is the right flavor for you. I think that's the bottom line here. Moving to another question. This is I guess I'll take this one because it's specifically about Permit.io. They're asking if Permit has a Google Zanzibar-like implementation. And yes, it's not a pure Google Zanzibar, but our cloud acts like a Zanzibar-like solution and supplies relevant APIs. And if you want to test it out, just click on Get Started. Next
side comment. So this is live stream about Zanzibar, but we are inviting you to join our community. Daniel will share the link soon in the chat, and we are always answering such questions.
Yes, you can always come with more questions, but let's continue. We don't have time.
Yeah.
So there's a question here about Amazon verified permissions and Cedar. There's the concept of a resource. So Cedar is kind of a more application level oriented policy language. They're asking, is there an equivalent in data models in FGA or Zanzibar? The answer is yes, but maybe John, you want to kind of embellish on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you can achieve pretty similar modeling semantics with Cedar. Their modeling languages opinionated in different ways. So they have kind of policy-based access control modeling language where you have resource action principle style, and if you can't express the model in those semantics, then it's going to be hard to express it in the Cedar language. But you could probably simulate pretty close to ReBAC based model in Cedar. Honestly, I haven't tinkered with Cedar too much, mostly OPA at this time. So I need to dive more into that for sure. But that would be my quick and short answer of that.
Here we can maybe refer, we had another masterclass with Andreas from OKTA and with Sarah from AWS, and we covered the differences there. So you can go to that video and double click on that. There's a question here on if Google will be launching a Google Zanzibar-like solution like AVP, but no one here I think knows the answer. But I'm guessing.
I want to underscore how little I know the answer. I'm wearing an old T-shirt here, but I've been gone for years. I wouldn't speak to it, but I will say this: it has been a while, so I don't think that you'll see the IAM and layer separate from that. So I don't see it there.
Yes, but
one thing I will say on that, I can say something on that. What's interesting in the industry right now is you see everyone's taking different approaches to these permission as a service kind of platforms. Amazon's stance is verifiability. So I actually think that they're trading off expressiveness a little bit, but what you're gaining is verifiability. And you can think about if you want to formally verify the semantics of your model, you have to constrain your modeling set, right? Because it's hard to formally verify an open-ended expression. It's easier to formally verify a less open-ended policy definition. So Amazon's taking it from a verifiability component, and others are taking it more from like an expressiveness, like pure expression. We won't formally verify the model for you, but you can express anything you want, and then there's a spectrum in between.
And don't forget, in that spectrum is also interaction between your authentication or directory system and your authorization system. Because in real world scenarios, you might say things like, this is over 50 grand. I want to double check that they've recently re-MFA'd and reauthorized and re-up. And so there's interaction in like continuous authorization, enforcement protocol, CAEP, AuthZen, another emerging standard, and so on. So remind ourselves that, while I value trackability, as real world stuff, look at your code and realize that there might be other reasons that there's practical considerations every level.
To sum up, it's not clear that Google is going to be launching anything around this, but there are plenty of other vendors, including OKTA here and ourselves that are providing such solutions. Moving to what I guess will be our last question. Is ReBAC, maybe our last question, we'll see if we have time. Is ReBAC a superset of RBAC in the sense that everything that RBAC can do, ReBAC can also do, or is there something that only RBAC can do? And what about ABAC? So let's start with, John, I think I'll hand this off to you. Let's start with RBAC and ReBAC, and then we'll touch on ABAC.
So the short answer is yes, ReBAC is a superset of RBAC. You can express any RBAC policy with a ReBAC policy. And actually, if you go on to openfga.dev and you look at our modeling guides, we actually have various modeling guides demonstrating that. In addition to that, so you mentioned ABAC. So that's where you'll start to see there's a spectrum of how expressive your modeling language can be. On one end, it's very opinionated and restrictive. I would consider that end to be RBAC. It's like you have a permission and the permission is a single string, and that's your policy definition. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have attribute-based access control, and that can be anything, an open-ended expression of any form. You can think about it could be any SQL query as your expression. Very expressive, but challenging from a data sense, potentially, because of all of the data required to evaluate those. ReBAC kind of sits somewhere in the middle, right? Like if you can express it as relationships, then you can express it. So a relationship-based access control model cannot express everything that an ABAC model could do. But similarly, an ABAC model can't efficiently evaluate a policy that involves relationships as easily as a system built for ReBAC can. So there are trade-offs there. If you need the expressiveness of a pure ABAC policy, you're going to struggle with ReBAC. But if you want extremely good performance of relational-based permission model, ReBAC is going to be a really nice fit for you, or in systems that implement ReBAC models.
Yeah, I'll maybe add there quickly. So if you want things like ownership or hierarchies, those are classic ReBAC things that will be easier to think with and easier to efficiently implement with ReBAC. If you want things that are like checking for geolocation, quotas, things that are highly dynamic, you're looking more at ABAC and more at your policy engines areas. And again, there are pros and cons. And you can also try and mix the two. For example, this is what we try to do. We're basically out of time. Rohit, last words?
No, I mean, I was just trying to type in a comment too about spelling errors. Right? When you get to ABAC, you can have something that's so expressive, but you can also make mistakes about like just prod versus dev, and someone else calls it production, right? So realize that, you have a trade-off in expressivity and constraint. But last words, look, any attempt to pull your externalized authorization out is going to longer and help you better out, even if you only pull out maybe basic things like who's your admin roles, and maybe it's only exposed to a percentage of your users, is a good place to start. Starting down this path is just the same thing as going back to the era in which you had to get things into databases and use SQL and use tables and not try to write your own marshalling and your own data files. We're at that stage. So please, I want to encourage anyone to join the community and check it out and try it out and realize you don't have to go model everything all at once. Just start somewhere.
Amen. John, what you want to send us off with?
Yeah, please stay involved in this community. The community will continue to evolve just like the authentication community evolved, 10 to 15 years ago. So the collaboration is great. Please don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on our team on the OpenFGA or OKTA FGA side of the house. And I'll just leave you with, please continue to sell the vision to your enterprises that authentication and authorization should be first-class citizens of design and product. And it should be pretty easily to sell the reason why, right? And these conversations that we've been having here, I hope will give you some leverage in those conversations in your organizations.
Amazing.
Authorization should not be an afterthought. Should be a first-class citizen of design. So
Amazing, spot on. I want to thank both of you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it was fun. I think it was hopeful, and I think it gave us a good baseline to continue working with the community and create amazing things for the future. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining this. The recording will be sent up to anyone who subscribed, and will also be available on our YouTube channel and in our community, as well as some of our social networks. Anything else that we should add before?
No, thank you for engagement, and yeah, a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye. Till next time.
see you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.